Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The year was 1878, and the desert near Silver Mesa stretched for miles. Empty, quiet, and sunburned. Elias Ward had built his cabin on the edge of that silence, far from town, far from people. The place was made of rough pine logs, patched with mud and clay, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of time. Inside, the air smelled of old smoke, dry wood, and solitude. Elias was 43, tall and weathered from years of ranch work and soldiering. His face carried the deep lines of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. He had fought in the frontier wars, worked cattle drives, buried friends, and most recently, his wife. The chair she once sat in still stood by the fire, untouched. Every night he looked at it, and every night he told himself he should move it. But he never did. That was his punishment and his memory. He wasn't running for anything now, not really. He was staying put because there was nothing left to chase. The small herd of cattle outside was just enough to keep him busy. Fences broke, he fixed them. Coyotes came too close, he scared them off. He didn't drink, didn't pray, didn't talk. Just lived one day to the next, like a man waiting for time to wear him out. Late that afternoon, the air changed. The desert went still in that strange way it does before a storm. The wind dropped, then came back sharper, carrying grit. Elias looked up from the broken fence post he was fixing and saw the sky turn a dark yellow-gray. A dust storm was rolling in fast from the west, swallowing the sun. He hurried to secure what he could, tied the mule inside the lean-to, shut the shutters, and brought the rifle in from the porch. Inside, the world turned into sound and movement. Wind slammed the cabin walls. Dust seeped through the cracks like smoke. Elias lit a lantern and sat by the table, listening. He'd been through worse. Still, storms like this had a way of stirring old things, memories, loneliness, fear. He rubbed his hands together and waited for it to pass. Then came a knock. At first, he thought it was the wind shifting something against the wall. But the sound came again, 3 soft knocks, deliberate. Elias froze. No one came out this far. He moved quietly, rifle in hand, and opened the door halfway. 4 figures stood in the storm. Young women, covered in dust and wrapped in torn blankets. Their faces were half hidden, their eyes wide and red from the wind. The eldest stepped forward, voice trembling but steady. "Please," she said, "we need shelter." Elias looked past them. No riders, no wagons. Just a wall of sand and sky. He lowered the rifle slowly. "Come in," he said. They entered one by one, silent except for their breathing. When he shut the door, the noise of the storm dimmed to a low roar. The room filled with the smell of dust and sweat. He motioned to the fire. "Sit," he said. "You can warm up there." The eldest nodded, guiding her sisters closer to the hearth. Their names came out between gasps: Ayoka, Nita, Tala, and Winona. Apache by the look and sound of them. Their clothes were rough deer hide, torn and burned at the edges. They looked exhausted, frightened, but not wild. Just hunted. Elias poured water into a tin cup and handed it to Ayoka. She passed it to her sisters before taking a sip herself. The way she moved, careful, alert, told him she was used to danger. He asked, "Where do you come from?" "From south," she said. "Mission camp. Soldiers burned it." Elias's jaw tightened. He'd heard stories like that before. He'd been part of some years ago, before the guilt pushed him into solitude. He looked at the youngest girl, Winona, maybe 15, her hands shaking as she tried to drink. "You hurt?" he asked. Ayoka shook her head. "Just tired." He nodded. "You can stay till the storm passes." That was all. He turned back to the fire, pretending not to notice their eyes on him. He knew what they saw: a white man with a rifle, a cabin in the middle of nowhere. They were right to be afraid. But Elias wasn't that man anymore. He watched the fire for a long time, thinking. They'd said soldiers burned their camp. That meant patrols might come this way. If the girls were found here, it'd look bad for them and for him. He felt his stomach twist. He'd lived quietly for years, careful not to get involved. But now Farlive had just stepped through his door. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You'll need food." he said finally. There's beans in the pot. They ate in silence, the sound of spoons and wind filling the room. Elias sat apart, watching. He didn't understand their language when they whispered to each other, but he recognized fear. He remembered it from the war, the look of someone who's lost their home and doesn't know if they'll live till morning. When the fire burned low, he stood. You can sleep there by the wall. I'll stay up. Ayoka met his eyes for the first time, studying him. Her expression was cautious, but not hostile, just tired like him. Outside, the storm screamed across the desert. Inside, for the first time in years, Elias wasn't alone. He sat in his chair, rifle across his lap, listening to the wind and the quiet breaths of the four girls. His thoughts turned heavy, of duty, of what he owed and what he couldn't undo. He didn't know yet that this was the beginning of something that would change him. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn them out. Not into that storm. Not ever. By morning, the storm had quieted, leaving the world covered in a thin red layer of dust. The desert outside looked like another planet, flat, colorless, and still. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy but calm. The four sisters were still asleep on the floor, wrapped in worn blankets Elias had given them. Their faces were streaked with dry dirt, their hands calloused from running and surviving. Elias sat by the window, watching the faint smoke rise from the ashes of the storm. His eyes were sunken but alert. He hadn't slept, just listened to the wind die down and the breathing of the four strangers in his home. For years, his nights had been filled with silence. Now it was broken by the small, human sounds of life. When Ayoka woke, she moved quietly, checking her sisters. She caught Elias watching her, but didn't flinch. Her look was cautious, assessing. The man didn't look cruel, but she had seen enough to know not to trust a face too quickly. Elias broke the silence first. "You're safe here," he said, his voice steady but distant. "No one comes this far." Ayoka nodded slowly. For now, he noticed her tone, tired but measured. She wasn't naive. She was leading the others, even if she was barely 20. He understood that kind of weight. He'd carried it once, when men followed his orders in battle. He poured water into a basin and pushed it across the table. "You can wash up." The sisters moved carefully, using what little water there was. Winona tried to smile when Elias handed her a cloth. She couldn't be more than 16, yet her eyes had that same hardened look the others carried. "Were there others from your camp?" Elias asked quietly. Ayoka hesitated, then shook her head. "Some were taken. Some ran the other way. We don't know." He nodded, jaw tightening. He didn't ask more. He knew what taken usually meant. As the morning light grew stronger, the cabin began to warm. Elias stepped outside to check the damage from the storm. The fence was half buried, the water barrels filled with red sand. He worked in silence, his mind turning over the same questions. How far had these girls traveled? Were the soldiers close behind? What would happen if they found them here? When he came back in, the sisters had cleaned the floor and tidied the table. Ayoka was mending one of the torn blankets using a thin thread she carried in a small pouch. Elias noticed the discipline in her movements, steady hands, deliberate actions. These weren't helpless wanderers. They were survivors. "You don't have to do that," he said. She looked up. "We do," she replied. "We earn our place." He didn't argue. He understood. The idea of earning one's keep was all a person had left after the world took everything else. By midday, the cabin had begun to feel less like a shelter and more like a fragile truce. They spoke little, but the silence wasn't as sharp as before. Nita helped grind corn. Tala swept the floor. Winona watched the window, eyes always scanning the horizon. Elias felt the unease in the air, the kind that comes when everyone is thinking the same thing, but no one says it. Finally, Ayoka broke it. "You fought before," she said. "I see it in how you watch the land." He didn't answer right away. His hands were on the rifle he was cleaning, movements careful and mechanical. "I fought," he said finally, "and I quit." She looked at him, curious. "Why?" "Too many dead. Too many for the wrong reasons." Ayoka's expression softened for the first time. "Then you understand what they did to us." Elias nodded once. "More than you think." The day went on slow. He gave them space, working outside while they stayed in. Still, his mind was restless. These girls were wanted, no doubt. If patrols came through, he'd be accused of harboring them. He had no loyalty left to the army or the government, but he also knew what it meant to stand against them. At sundown, the desert glowed red and gold. Elias cooked beans and salt pork. The smell filled the small room. They ate quietly. The tension had thinned, replaced by something uncertain but less fearful. When the youngest, Winona, finished eating, she looked up shyly. "Will you send us away tomorrow?" Elias looked at her, then at Ayoka. "Not till you're ready to go," he said. Ayoka's shoulders eased slightly, though she didn't smile. "We'll be gone soon," she said. "We don't bring trouble." Elias stirred the fire with the poker, his voice low. "Trouble finds everyone. You just make sure it doesn't take you twice." That night, he sat outside the cabin under the stars. The desert was calm again, the silence deep but peaceful. Inside, the sisters slept close together near the fire. Elias listened to the soft crackle of wood and the distant call of coyotes. He thought about what Ayoka said, about earning a place, about leaving soon. He knew she meant it, but something in him wished they wouldn't go. He didn't say it out loud, not even to himself. For the first time in years, the sound of breathing inside his cabin felt like a reason to stay awake and to protect something again. He leaned his rifle against the wall, exhaled slowly, and whispered into the night, "You can stay as long as you need." Inside, Ayoka's eyes opened in the dark. She had heard him, and for the first time since the raid, she closed her eyes without fear. The next morning broke quiet and cold. The sun was pale behind thin clouds, turning the desert into a washed-out canvas of browns and golds. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to embers. Elias stirred it back to life, his movements slow but practiced. The sisters were still asleep, wrapped in blankets near the hearth, their hair tangled and faces calm for the first time since they'd arrived. He took a long look at them before stepping outside. The ground was crusted with fine red dust from the storm. His fences still leaned, the troughs were half buried, and the mule brayed softly from the lean-to. Work waited as always. He grabbed his hat and started clearing sand from the corral, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin, for strangers under his roof, for reasons for the army to come knocking. He knew what harboring runaways meant, but he also knew what it meant to send them back. By the time he returned, the sisters were awake and moving about. Ayoka was feeding the fire, Nita and Tala were washing dishes with what little water they had left, and Winona was combing her hair with a broken piece of bone. Elias noticed how organized they were, how quickly they turned fear into purpose. "You girls ever lived on your own before?" he asked. Ayoka looked up. "We lived in the mission camp. We worked, we cooked, we learned some English. We were told we were safe there." She paused, her tone hardening. "We weren't." Elias didn't press her. He just nodded and handed her a clean cloth to dry the dishes. The conversation was done, but the silence that followed felt lighter, less guarded. Later that day, he showed them the well behind the cabin. It was shallow and half dry, but enough to get by. He explained where to find firewood and which trails to avoid. They listened closely. He could tell they were learning the land the way only those who planned to survive did. When the sun reached its peak, they all worked together, patching holes in the roof left by the storm. Elias climbed the ladder while the sisters handed him shingles and nails. The sight was strange but steady. 5 people working side by side without speaking much, but understanding what needed to be done. At one point, Winona giggled when a hammer slipped from Elias's hand and hit his boot. The sound startled everyone. Elias looked down, then chuckled quietly. The laugh was short, almost foreign to his own ears. Ayoka noticed it, though she didn't say anything. That night, the cabin felt different. They ate in a calmer rhythm, beans, corn, and a bit of jerky. Elias caught himself looking at them longer than usual, studying their faces, wondering who they were before all this. When he finally asked, it was gentle. "You got family left somewhere?" Ayoka's eyes went to the fire. "Maybe. Our mother was taken years ago. Our father died when we were children. The mission said they'd protect us, teach us new ways." Her jaw tightened. They protected no one. Elias stared into the flames. He'd seen the same kind of promises, made by men with power, broken by the same hands that offered them. "You're safe here," he said finally. "I'll make sure of it." Ayoka looked at him carefully, trying to read if he meant it. "Why?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "Because someone once did the same for me, and I wasn't worth half of what you are." The sisters exchanged quiet glances. It wasn't gratitude exactly, but something close. The kind of respect that comes from recognizing pain in someone else. The following days fell into rhythm. Morning chores, repairs, and quiet meals. The cabin turned from a shelter into something like a home. Winona began humming softly while cooking. Nita cleaned and organized Elias's shelves. Tala learned how to saddle the mule without being asked. The sound of women's voices, soft laughter, light conversation, started to fill the silence that had once been unbearable. Still, Elias kept his guard. Each evening, he checked the horizon before dusk, watching for riders or the distant dust of patrols. He never saw anyone, but he knew the peace couldn't last forever. One evening, as the sun went down, he stood outside watching the red light fade over the mesa. Ayoka joined him quietly. "You live far from everyone," she said. "That's the point," he replied. "Why?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I fought for men who said they wanted peace, but brought war instead. I got tired of watching good people die for nothing. This was the only place left that didn't ask questions." Ayoka studied him in silence. The desert wind tugged at her hair, and she pulled her shawl tighter. "Then maybe we're the same," she said. "You ran from what broke you. We ran from who broke us." Elias looked at her, meeting her eyes for the first time in full light. "Maybe," he said quietly. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It carried understanding. When night came, the fire burned low, and the sisters settled in. Elias sat in his chair, the rifle leaning nearby. His gaze moved across the room, at the blankets, the shadows, the faces resting peacefully. He realized that for the first time in years, he didn't dread the next morning. The emptiness that had once filled the cabin was gone, replaced by something steady and alive. He didn't know what to call it yet. Maybe duty, maybe redemption, but it made him breathe deeper. Outside, the coyotes called across the desert. Inside, Elias Ward finally closed his eyes and slept without dreams. The morning came with clear skies and the smell of damp wood. The rain from a night before had settled the dust, leaving the air crisp and still. Elias woke before sunrise, as he always did, but something about the cabin felt different now. Less like a shelter for one man and more like a place people lived in again. The sound of quiet movement came from the corner of the room. Ayoka was stirring the fire, careful not to wake her sisters. Elias dressed and stepped outside, the boards creaking beneath his boots. The desert stretched out before him, wide, gold, and endless. A faint breeze carried the scent of wet soil, something rare enough to make a man stop and breathe it in. He walked out to check the fences and water troughs, trying to keep his thoughts fixed on routine, but the image of the sisters lingered in his mind. He still didn't know what he would do if soldiers rode through or if anyone asked questions. Keeping them here meant risk. Sending them away meant guilt. When he returned, Ayoka was by the table, washing the tin cups. The others were outside, hanging clothes to dry. She glanced at him briefly, then spoke. "You work alone here, every day?" He nodded. "That's how I've kept breathing. You don't go to town?" "Not unless I need salt, bullets, or wire." People ask too many questions. Ayoka gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. "Then we'll make sure they don't have reason to come." The way she said we caught him off guard. He noticed how easily she'd included herself in his world, even if only in words. It wasn't something he wanted to admit, but the idea of them leaving unsettled him now. Later that day, while Elias was chopping wood near the shed, Winona came running from the cabin, calling his name. "Mr. Ward, Ayoka wants you to see something." He set the axe down and followed her inside. Ayoka stood near the window, holding a small framed photograph, dusty, faded, and tucked behind a pile of old tools. It was of a woman with dark hair tied back, wearing a simple dress, standing beside Elias in front of the same cabin. His wife, Margaret. Ayoka held the photo carefully, her eyes soft. Your woman, she said quietly. Elias froze for a moment before taking it from her hands. My wife, he said, his voice low. She's gone. Ayoka nodded slowly. I thought so. You still keep her close. He stared at the picture a long time before setting it back on the shelf. She died 3 winters ago. Fever came through Silver Mesa. Took her before I could get help. The room went quiet except for the faint hiss of the fire. Ayoka's tone softened. That's why you stay here alone? Part of it, he said. After she was gone, I couldn't stand the sound of people's voices. Every sound reminded me she wasn't one of them. Ayoka looked around the cabin. The handmade furniture, the small cross above the door, the patched blanket on the bed. She made this place feel alive, she said. She did, he replied. Until she didn't. There was no self-pity in his tone, just the dry honesty of a man who had already buried everything worth explaining. The rest of the day passed quietly. The sisters worked in the garden, clearing weeds, gathering wild herbs from the edge of the creek. Elias helped them build a better fire pit outside. The small things began to give shape to something unspoken, a rhythm between them, one built on simple trust and shared labor. That evening, as the sun sank low, turning the desert red and orange, the sisters sat by the fire eating stew. Winona hummed softly under her breath. Nita and Tala teased each other in their language. Elias watched them, realizing how long it had been since laughter filled these walls. Ayoka was quieter than usual. She kept her eyes on the fire, but seemed distracted. After a while, Elias asked, You got something on your mind? She hesitated, then said, You asked before if we had family left. There's something I didn't tell you. He leaned back in his chair, listening. Our mother, she was taken by soldiers years ago. They said they'd bring her to Fort Lincoln to teach her sewing and housework. We never saw her again. We were put in a mission after that. They said we'd learn to be proper women. Her voice hardened. They took our names, our language, and told us we'd thank them for it one day. Elias stared into the fire. He'd seen missions like that, funded by good intentions and built on cruelty. He didn't tell her he'd once guarded one of them. He didn't tell her he'd stood on the other side of the same fear. Instead, he said quietly, You shouldn't have had to live through that. She met his gaze. You fought for them once, didn't you? Elias didn't answer immediately. The question was sharp but fair. I did, he said finally. I thought I was fighting for peace. I learned too late it was about land. Her expression softened. Not forgiveness, but understanding. And now you're alone. He nodded. Seems that's the price. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire popped, and the night wind pressed against the cabin walls. Then Ayoka said, We lost everything too, but maybe not forever. Elias looked up curious. What makes you think that? She smiled faintly. Because sometimes we find people we weren't supposed to, and they keep us alive. He didn't respond, but the words settled deep. That night, as everyone slept, Elias sat by the window watching stars. His thoughts drifted between his wife's photograph and the 4 girls sleeping near the fire. He wasn't sure what he was protecting them from anymore, the world outside or the ghosts in his own mind. The truth was, he hadn't felt needed in years. And now he did. When dawn came, the cabin was still. Elias reached for the rifle by his chair and looked toward the horizon, scanning for dust trails. Somewhere out there, soldiers were still looking for these girls. Somewhere out there, the past he'd buried was stirring again. But inside the cabin, for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace. Not the kind born from silence, but from purpose. He set the rifle down and whispered to himself, Not this time. Then he stood, ready to face whatever came next. By the time the sun went down, the desert had turned dark and cold. The heat that baked the land during the day was gone, replaced by a biting wind that slipped through the cracks of the cabin walls. Elias finished securing the shutters, checked the latch on the door, and dropped a few extra logs into the fire. The flames flickered across the room, throwing uneven light on the rough wooden walls and the tired faces of the 4 sisters huddled near the hearth. Dinner had been quiet. The day's work, repairing the roof, gathering wood, tending to the garden, had left everyone worn out. Elias noticed the girls ate slower now, more relaxed than they had when they first arrived. The fear that once filled the room had softened into something closer to exhaustion. He sat in his chair, hands resting on his knees, staring into the fire. The flames reminded him of nights from long ago, soldiers camped in the wilderness, his wife mending a torn sleeve by the same kind of light, the sound of voices that were now gone. The memories came more often lately, but they hurt less when he looked at these four strangers who had somehow made the silence bearable. Outside, the wind began to pick up again. It moaned through the canyon and rattled the walls, the sound almost human. The youngest, Winona, shifted closer to her sisters. Nita reached out and took her hand. Ayoka, sitting a few feet away from Elias, kept her gaze on the door as if expecting it to open at any moment. Elias noticed her unease. "The storm won't last," he said. She nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on the shadows near the window. "It's not the storm," she said quietly. He waited. She glanced at her sisters, then back at him. "Sometimes at night, when it's quiet, I still hear the men from the mission. The shouts, the fire." Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to steady it. "My sisters wake up crying. They think they're still there." Elias felt the muscles in his chest tighten. He looked away from the fire, jaw hard. "You're not there anymore," he said. "You're here now. No one's going to touch you while you're under this roof." Ayoka looked at him, searching for any sign of doubt, but found none. She gave a small nod and whispered, "Thank you." The wind howled harder, shaking the windows. Elias stood, walked to the door, and checked the bolt again. "Storm like this won't stop till morning," he said. "You should all sleep close to the fire." The sisters began to settle down, spreading their blankets. Elias went to his cot near the corner and sat down, removing his boots. The floorboards creaked with every step, the air filled with the low crackle of firewood and the whistle of wind outside. After a few minutes of silence, Ayoka spoke again, her tone quiet but steady. "You can't stay up every night watching the door, Elias." He looked over at her. "Someone has to." She hesitated, then said softly, "We came to share your bed." The words hung in the air, still and fragile. Winona turned her head, eyes half open. Nita and Tala looked up from their blankets, but Ayoka's eyes never left his. Elias straightened in his chair, unsure how to respond. His first thought was confusion, then caution. "You don't have to do that," he said firmly. Ayoka shook her head slowly. "It's not what you think. We don't mean it that way." She struggled for the right words in English. "It means we trust you. We feel safe near you. When we sleep far, the nightmares come back." Elias exhaled, understanding now. The tension in his shoulders eased. He rubbed the back of his neck and nodded once. "All right," he said quietly. "You can stay close. Just keep your blankets." Ayoka gave a small smile, one that faded as quickly as it came. She spread her blanket near the fire, the others following her lead until the floor was covered with layers of worn fabric and warmth. Elias laid down nearby, not beside them, but close enough to hear their breathing. The wind pressed harder against the walls, but inside the cabin, the sound of fear began to fade. Winona fell asleep first, her head resting on her sister's shoulder. Tala's breathing slowed. Nita whispered a short prayer in Apache before closing her eyes. Ayoka stayed awake the longest, watching the fire flicker against Elias's face. He felt her gaze and spoke without looking up. "You don't have to keep watch tonight. I'll hear it first if anyone comes." "I know," she said, "but I don't sleep much." Elias turned his head toward her. "You will. Eventually." She smiled faintly, then pulled the blanket tighter. "Do you ever sleep?" He hesitated. "Not when I should." Ayoka studied him for a moment. "You carry something heavy," she said. He didn't answer, but the silence between them said enough. As the night deepened, the storm outside began to fade. The wind softened, the fire burned lower, and the room grew still. Elias felt his eyes grow heavy. He listened to the slow rhythm of their breathing, the sound of life, of trust. It was strange how quickly the cabin had changed. A week ago, it had been a tomb of memories. Now it was filled with people who needed him. Before sleep took him, his thoughts drifted to the question he'd been avoiding. What happens when someone comes looking for them? He pushed it away for now. There would be time to deal with that later. For the first time in years, Elias Ward fell asleep beside others, not haunted by ghosts, but surrounded by the living. When morning came, sunlight broke through the shutters, landing across the floor. Ayoka was still awake, sitting up against the wall, her eyes calm and watchful. Elias opened his eyes, met her gaze, and for the first time since the war, he felt something simple and pure: trust. It wasn't spoken, but it was real, and it was enough. The days that followed carried a strange quiet, a kind that felt neither tense nor empty, but uncertain, like the land itself was holding its breath. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a sky so bright it hurt to look at. The desert had turned soft and damp in patches, small green shoots pressing through the dirt like the world had decided to start over. Elias woke early each morning, as he always did, but now there were sounds that hadn't been there before. Soft voices, laughter, the scrape of pots. He'd grown used to the rhythm of living alone, but the cabin had taken on a new shape with the sisters in it. The air smelled of stew and would smoke instead of dust and silence. Even the mule seemed calmer, as if it too sensed that the loneliness had lifted. Ayoka took charge of small things without being asked, sweeping the floor, keeping the fire steady, portioning food so it would last. Nita was the quiet one, always outside, collecting herbs and wild onions near the creek. Tala, curious and restless, followed Elias on his morning rounds, learning how to mend fences and check for broken rails. Winona was the youngest, still carrying traces of fear, but she smiled more now, especially when Elias let her feed the mule or showed her how to grind corn. Elias noticed the change in himself, too. He found he was talking again, not much, but enough. Short words, practical advice, sometimes even a dry joke. He hadn't heard himself laugh in years. The sound came out rough, unfamiliar but real. He didn't know what the sisters planned or how long they would stay. He didn't ask. What mattered was that they were alive, and as long as they were under his roof, no one would harm them. One afternoon, while Elias was repairing the corral gate, Ayoka brought him water in a tin cup. "You work too much," she said. He squinted against the sun. "Work keeps the mind quiet. Or it hides what you don't want to remember," she replied. He gave her a look, half stern, half amused. "You sound like someone twice your age." "I had to be," she said simply. There was no resentment in her tone, just truth. Elias respected that. He met men twice her age who couldn't face life with that kind of steadiness. Later that evening, as the heat of the day faded, they all sat outside watching the sunset. The sky burned orange over the mesas, and for the first time, Elias saw the desert not as a prison, but as something alive. The sisters were relaxed, their laughter quiet and free. Tala was trying to braid wind on his hair, while Nita sang softly under her breath. It was simple, human, and for a man like Elias, who'd spent years drowning in silence, it felt like something close to redemption. But peace, he knew, was fragile. 2 days later, while Elias was cutting wood near the creek, he saw dust rising far off on the ridge. He set down his axe, squinting against the glare. It was faint, but unmistakable, riders. Maybe 2, maybe 3. He waited until the dust disappeared behind the hills before heading back to the cabin. That night, he didn't say anything to the sisters. There was no need to scare them until he was sure. But his eyes lingered longer on the horizon before sundown, and he oiled his rifle before setting it beside the door. Ayoka noticed. "Something's coming," she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "The way you watch the distance," she replied. "My people call it listening with the eyes. It means you've seen danger before." Elias didn't deny it. "Maybe," he said, "could just be riders passing through." Ayoka's gaze held steady. "And if it's not?" He exhaled slowly. "Then we stay quiet and wait." The next morning, he saddled the mule and rode out toward the ridge. The sun was sharp, the air dry. He found what he expected: hoof prints, 3 sets, heading north toward the mission road. The riders hadn't stopped, but they'd passed close enough to see smoke from his chimney. That was enough to make him uneasy. When he returned, Ayoka was waiting at the gate. "You saw them," she said. He nodded. They're gone now. But if the army's looking for anyone, they'll come back. She looked away, her hands tightening around the edge of her shawl. We can leave if it puts you in danger. Elias shook his head. Not yet. You'd never make it far on foot. The land out there isn't kind, and the patrols won't care if you're just trying to live. Ayoka's eyes softened, but there was something else in them now, a mix of gratitude and guilt. You don't owe us this. He adjusted his hat. Maybe not, but someone once gave me a chance when I didn't deserve it. Guess I'm just passing it on. That night, they kept the lamps low. The sisters stayed near the fire while Elias sat by the window, rifle across his knees. He could hear Winona whispering prayers in her language. Ayoka sat awake beside her, hands folded tightly. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of coyotes and the shifting of the sand. The world felt tense again, but not hopeless. Elias thought about the life he'd led, the war, the losses, the guilt. He'd tried to live without purpose, but it had found him anyway, in the shape of 4 frightened girls at his door. And now, whatever came next, he knew he wouldn't turn them away. Before dawn, he finally spoke, his voice low but certain. You're safe here, as long as I'm breathing. Ayoka turned toward him. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable, but her eyes glistened faintly in the firelight. She gave a single nod. Then we'll stay, she said. The words hung in the air like a promise, not just of safety, but of belonging. As the first light of morning crept through the cracks of the cabin walls, Elias felt something shift deep inside him. It wasn't relief exactly, but resolve. He knew the peace wouldn't last forever, but for now, it was theirs. He sat back in his chair, the sound of breathing around him steady and warm. For the first time in years, he wasn't guarding ghosts, he was guarding life. And for him, that was enough reason to fight again if the time came. 3 quiet days passed after the sighting on the ridge. The air stayed heavy, filled with the kind of silence that warned more than it soothed. Elias worked the same as before, mending fences, hauling water, keeping the cabin running, but his eyes never stopped searching the horizon. Each sunset stretched longer than the last, and each night he slept less. He didn't tell the sisters how close the riders had come. He didn't need to. Ayoka already sensed it. The morning it happened, the desert was bright and still. A clear blue sky, no wind, no movement, just heat rising in slow waves off the sand. Elias was outside, splitting logs when he heard it first, the faint rhythmic thud of hooves. He turned toward the west, jaw tightening. The sound grew louder, sharper, until it became distinct. The march of horses, the jingle of bridles, the dull ring of steel. Soldiers! He dropped the axe, went to the door, and called quietly, Ayoka. She came out, her face pale in the sunlight. They're here, he said. She didn't ask who. Her eyes flicked to the desert behind him, and when she saw the line of riders approaching, her body tensed like a drawn bow. What will you do? Elias looked back toward the approaching dust cloud. What I have to. He told her to get the others inside, to stay low and keep quiet. The girls moved fast, shutting the shutters and clearing any sign that they'd been living there. Ayoka started to hide the blankets and dishes, but Elias stopped her. No, he said. Leave it. If they see this place looks empty, they'll start asking questions. Let them see a home. By the time the riders reached the clearing, the air was full of tension. There were 5 of them, dust-covered, armed, wearing the insignia of the territorial cavalry. Their leader, a tall man with a gray mustache and sunburned face, dismounted first. Elias recognized the look immediately, the same cold authority he'd once followed. Morning, the officer said, his tone flat but measured. You Elias Ward? I am. Captain Briggs, Fort Lincoln. We're looking for 4 Apache escapees from a mission south of here. Young women. Came through this territory about a week ago. You seen anything? Elias met his eyes without flinching. No. Briggs studied him a moment, his gaze sharp. You live alone out here? I do, Elias replied. Been that way 3 years. The officer's eyes shifted toward the cabin. Mind if we take a look inside? Elias didn't move. I mind. Briggs smiled faintly, the kind of smile that meant trouble. You know, Ward, We've got orders to search all homesteads between the ridge and the river. I'd hate to think you're hiding something." Elias kept his voice calm. "Ain't hiding anything. You can look around out here. My homestay's private." The two men stared at each other, the space between them thick with quiet defiance. Elias knew the risk. Refusing an officer could mean arrest, or worse. But he also knew what they'd do if they found the girls. Briggs finally dismounted fully, his boots crunching the dry soil. "You were cavalry once, weren't you?" he said, glancing at the old Springfield rifle near the door. Elias didn't deny it. "A long time ago." "Then you know what it means to follow orders." "I also know when they're wrong," Elias said. Briggs' expression hardened. He gestured to one of his men. "Search the shed." Elias took a step forward, blocking his path. "You won't find what you're looking for." The younger soldier hesitated, glancing between them. Briggs raised an eyebrow. "You think you can stop us, old man?" Elias' tone stayed calm, but his stance was iron. "I don't need to stop you. I'm just telling you there's nothing here worth taking." For a long moment, no one moved. The wind picked up, carrying dust between them. Then, from inside the cabin, something faint like a small clatter. A cup knocked over. Briggs' head turned instantly. "What was that?" Elias' jaw tightened. "My mule," he said, but the lie was too slow. The captain's hand went to his revolver. "Inside," he ordered. Elias didn't move. His voice dropped low, quiet but firm. "You draw that gun in my yard, and I'll bury you here." For a heartbeat, the world froze. The younger soldiers shifted uneasily. Briggs studied Elias's face, saw no fear in it, and slowly lowered his hand. "You're making a mistake," he said. Elias met his gaze. "Already made plenty." The silence stretched on until Briggs finally spat in the dirt, signaling his men to mount up. "If they're here and I find out you lied, I'll come back with 10 more men. Think about that." Elias nodded once. "I have." The soldiers rode off, their figures fading into the horizon. Dust settled over the clearing like ash. When the sound of hooves was gone, Elias turned and opened the door. The sisters were huddled near the floor, pale and silent. Winona's eyes were wet. Ayoka stood, her hands trembling but her chin high. "They were ready to kill you," she whispered. "They've done worse for less," Elias said. She stepped closer, voice shaking. "Why risk it?" He looked at her, his answer plain. "Because you don't send people back to hell once they've found a way out." The room stayed quiet. The fire had gone out. He could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on all of them. Finally, Ayoka reached for his arm, not out of fear, but out of understanding. "You didn't have to protect us," she said softly. Elias shook his head. "I did." That's what a man does when he finally figures out what kind of man he wants to be. That night, the desert was silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't empty. It was alive, filled with gratitude, relief, and something deeper neither of them dared to name. As the sisters slept, Elias sat by the window, watching the moonlight spread across the sand. The world outside still carried danger, but inside that cabin, for now, there was peace, and it was a peace he would defend with his life. When dawn came, Ayoka stepped outside and found him sitting by the porch, his rifle across his lap. He looked tired, older than before but steady. She said nothing, just sat beside him. They watched the sun rise together, the sky turning from dark blue to gold. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Elias said quietly, "They'll be back one day." Ayoka nodded. "Then we'll be ready." He turned to her, the faintest trace of a smile in his eyes. "We already are." The sun rose clean and sharp the morning after the soldiers left. The air was cool, the horizon stretched in soft gold, and for the first time in weeks, the world around the cabin was still. Elias sat on the porch, boots planted on the step, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. The night had been long, sleepless. His body felt heavy, but his mind was alert, turning over the same thoughts. How close it had come, how easily everything could have ended. Inside, the sisters were waking slowly. Ayoka moved first, silent as always, checking her sisters before stirring the fire back to life. Tala and Nita began preparing a simple breakfast of beans and cornbread. Winona, still shaken from the soldier's visit, stayed near the window, her eyes scanning the open land. Elias could see her through the half-open door, small, fragile, but trying to be brave. He didn't go inside at first. He needed a moment to think. What happened yesterday meant the army now had his name. They'd remember the man who stood against them. He knew they might return with orders and no patience next time. Still, something inside him had changed. The fear he expected to feel wasn't there. In its place was a kind of clarity. He looked toward the desert and realized he no longer saw it as a place to hide. It had become something worth defending. When he stepped back into the cabin, the smell of coffee and bread filled the air. The sisters looked up, cautious but calm. Ayoka handed him a tin cup. "You didn't sleep," she said. Elias shook his head. "Didn't feel like closing my eyes." "Because of them?" He took a slow sip before answering. "Because of what comes next." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, just thoughtful. Nita finally spoke, her voice quiet but sure. "If you want us to leave, we will. We don't want to bring more trouble." Elias looked around the room, at the blankets neatly folded, the repaired tools, the small details of life that hadn't existed here before they arrived. "This place was dead before you came," he said. "Now it's not. That's reason enough for me." Ayoka met his eyes, steady and searching. "Then what will you do if they come again?" He set the cup down. "Same as before. Only this time, I'll be ready." The sisters exchanged looks. Tala's hand tightened around her spoon, and Winona's eyes filled with quiet worry. Ayoka didn't argue, but her jaw set firm. "If we stay," she said, "we work, we build. We don't hide like ghosts." Elias nodded. "That's the only way I'd have it." The next few weeks passed with a rhythm that felt almost normal. Together, they rebuilt what the storm and time had broken. Elias taught Tala how to fix fence wire without slicing her hands. Nita learned how to track coyote trails near the creek and set traps for rabbits. Winona started a small patch of corn near the cabin, her laughter returning piece by piece. Ayoka helped Elias with the harder work, cutting timber, digging a new water trench, sealing the gaps in the roof. It was work that left everyone sore but proud. The days grew longer, the land warmer. What was once a refuge for one broken man had become a small outpost of life, a place where laughter mixed with hammer blows and silence no longer carried pain. Still, there were moments when the past lingered like a shadow. One night, when the sky was full of stars and the wind soft through the canyon, Ayoka sat beside Elias outside the cabin. They didn't speak at first. The desert stretched quiet before them, endless and open. Finally, she said, "When I was small, I used to believe there were good men somewhere. Men who didn't take, didn't command, didn't destroy. But after the raids, after the mission, I stopped believing that." Elias glanced at her. "And now?" Her voice lowered. "Now I think I was wrong to stop." He looked away, uncomfortable with praise, his eyes on the horizon. "I'm no saint, Ayoka. I've done things that don't wash off easy." "I know," she said, "but you stopped doing them. That's what makes you different." He nodded slightly, not trusting himself to answer. The silence between them was calm, filled with the sound of wind brushing the dry grass. Inside, Winona's laughter echoed faintly, followed by Tala's teasing. For the first time in a long time, the sound didn't hurt Elias. It sounded like life, unpolished, imperfect, but good. As the days passed, rumors from the nearest town reached them through the occasional trader who passed by. The army had abandoned the search. The mission was gone. No one was looking for the girls anymore. When Elias told them, the sisters didn't celebrate. They just sat quietly, taking in what it meant. Freedom was a strange thing. It sounded simpler than it felt. "So now," Elias said that night, "you could leave if you wanted." Ayoka looked at him, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "And go where?" "There's nothing left out there but empty land and bad memories." "You could start over," he said. "Find your people. Make a home." She shook her head slowly. "We already did." The words struck him deeper than he expected. He turned toward the fire, not saying anything. Ayoka stood, adjusting her shawl, and added softly, "This cabin isn't just yours anymore, Elias. It's ours, if you'll have us." He met her gaze, serious and steady. "I already do." That night, for the first time since the day they arrived, the door to the cabin was left unlocked. The air was warm, the fire steady. No one stayed awake to listen for danger. In the quiet that followed, the desert outside seemed to exhale. The fear that had haunted them all since the raid was finally gone. When morning came, the light poured through the windows, soft and golden. The garden glowed with new sprouts. Elias stepped outside, the smell of rain still faint in the air, and looked over the land. He'd spent years believing his life had ended with his wife's death, but hadn't. It had just been waiting to begin again. He turned toward the cabin where the sisters moved about, preparing breakfast, talking, laughing. The sound carried across the open plain like something sacred. For the first time in his life, Elias Ward didn't feel alone. And he knew, deep down, that he never would again. Summer came to the desert with the smell of dry grass and the hum of cicadas. The sky turned a deeper blue, and the sun climbed higher each day, casting sharp light across the valley where Elias's cabin stood. The land around it, once empty and silent, now showed signs of life. Rows of green corn, a patch of wildflowers near the fence, a small coop where Tala kept two hens that refused to stop clucking. Elias stood outside early that morning, wiping sweat from his brow, watching Ayoka and Nita pull water from the well. Winona carried a basket of herbs toward the garden while Tala swept the porch, grumbling about the dust that never seemed to stay gone. Their movements were practiced now, steady, familiar, almost domestic. For months, they had lived this way, and what began as survival had slowly turned into something that looked like home. The soldiers hadn't returned. Word from a passing trader confirmed what Elias already suspected. The army had moved on, the mission reports forgotten. The girls were ghosts on paper now, names crossed out, cases closed. They were free, though none of them said it out loud, as if speaking it might undo it. Inside, the cabin had changed too. The bare walls were now covered with small things. Woven strings of beads from the sisters' hands, a few wildflowers in a tin cup, a patched blanket that carried their scent. The photo of Elias's wife still stood by the window, but now it shared space with four small wooden figures he'd carved, each one shaped after the sisters. It wasn't something he planned, it just felt right. At night, the cabin glowed with warmth. The girls would sit by the fire, telling stories in a mix of Apache and English, their laughter soft against the crackling wood. Elias would listen, saying little, though every word sank deep. He didn't understand everything they said, but he understood what it meant. The sound of peace, of people who had finally stopped running. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mesas, Ayoka joined Elias outside. The horizon burned orange, the air still and heavy with heat. She sat beside him on the porch, her hands resting in her lap. "You never told me why you came out here," she said quietly. Elias watched the sun a moment longer before answering. "After the war ended, I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd done things I couldn't justify. People I cared about were gone. So, I came here, thought if I got far enough away, maybe the noise in my head would stop. Did it?" He looked at her, a faint smile touching his face. "Not until you all showed up." Ayoka smiled back, a small, knowing look. "You saved us, Elias." He shook his head. "No, you gave me a reason to stop dying." The quiet stretched between them, easy and full. The desert breeze moved softly through the grass, and for once, the silence wasn't heavy, it was alive. As night came, they lit the lamp and went inside. The sisters were preparing supper, the smell of stew filling the cabin. Winona was humming an old song from her tribe, and Nita joined in, their voices blending like a lullaby. Tala stirred the pot, pretending not to enjoy it, but smiling all the same. Elias sat down at the table. For a long while, he just watched them move about, the glow of the lamplight catching their faces. He thought of his wife, not with pain this time, but with a quiet understanding. She had loved him once for his kindness, for his steadiness. If she could see him now, he hoped she'd understand that he'd finally become the man she believed he could be. When they all sat down to eat, there were no words of prayer, just a moment of stillness. Elias raised his tin cup slightly. "To better days," he said. The sisters smiled, repeating the words softly, "Better days." After supper, as the fire burned low, Winona sat near Elias, her eyes half closed with sleep. "You think we'll ever have to leave?" she asked. Elias looked at her, then around the room. "No," he said simply. "You're home now." She smiled faintly and drifted off, her head resting on Tala's shoulder. Ayoka stood by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the desert. She turned toward Elias. "You could have sent us away 100 times," she said. "But you didn't." Elias leaned back in his chair, his voice low and steady. "Some things are worth standing for, even when no one's watching." Ayoka nodded. "And now," he said, "I'm done running from ghosts." The words settled into the quiet room like truth. Days turned into weeks. The corn grew tall. The laughter inside the cabin became part of the land itself, blending with the wind and the call of the hawks overhead. When autumn came, they gathered what they'd grown, storing it for winter. Elias carved new shelves for the pantry, and Ayoka stitched heavier curtains for the cold months ahead. Life had shape now, steady, ordinary, but precious. One evening, as the first chill of the season rolled in, Elias stepped outside and looked over the valley. The sun was setting behind the distant ridge, painting the world in gold. The cabin glowed from within, voices and firelight spilling through the cracks. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the dry, clean air. For years, the silence of this land had been his punishment. Now was his peace. When he went back inside, the sisters were waiting at the table. Ayoka met his eyes and smiled. "Sit," she said softly. "You're one of us now." Elias sat down, the warmth of the fire touching his face. The sound of laughter filled the room again, steady and alive. Outside, the wind moved across the desert, gentle and constant. Inside, 5 lives, once broken by loss, had built something unshakable. And for the first time in all his years, Elias Ward didn't just survive the silence. He lived in it. The cabin at the edge of the desert was no longer a place of grief. It had become a home, and as the firelight flickered against the wooden walls, the story of a widowed cowboy and 4 Apache sisters ended not with goodbye, but with the quiet certainty of belonging.